Side-scrolling platformers have something of a reputation for telling stories that are little more than a motivation for the hero. I mean, Mario is trying to save the princess, Sonic needs to save his animal friends, and Bubsy is stopping an alien invasion by collecting yarn balls. There's no character development, no big twist, and nothing resembling a 3-act structure. But that's not the case when it comes to the new game Where's Samantha by Respect Studios. Here's a 2D platformer that wants you to genuinely care for the characters and be moved by their epic adventure. And you will for most of the journey. Unfortunately, it also proves to be the game's biggest liability. Where's Samantha is a perfect example of how a good game can be completely undermined by a terrible ending. Forget where Samantha is for a moment because we first need to address a more pressing question. Who is Samantha? The simple answer is that she's a small swatch of fabric who is madly in love with George, a fellow piece of fabric who has no idea what's in store for him. When a mighty gust of wind blows the love of his life away, George leaps into action to brave a sewn-together world full of puzzles and bottomless pits in order to rescue Samantha. As setups go, this one is right in line with all of those 2D platformers that I mentioned at the start of this review. But where that's the end of the story for most games, where Samantha uses it as a jumping off point to explore what George is going through. He's not your typical hero, and not just because he's a piece of fabric. He's full of self-doubt and more than a little insecure about his relationship with Samantha. We explore all this in great detail thanks to a lengthy story read by none other than British comedian Rufus Hound. You know, I'd like to say that all this is in his head, but there's a good case to be made that George has real reason to be concerned. In order to solve the game's many puzzles, he'll need to team up with clones that look and sound identical to him in every single way. There's also Frank, a tall swatch of fabric who can double jump. What if Samantha is fooled by one of those clones, or ends up falling for the taller and more talented Frank? As worried as George is, he still has an important job to do. He runs, jumps, and puzzle solves his way through 45 bite-sized stages. He does this by sewing on different types of fabrics in order to interact with the world in different ways. For example, by merging with Frank, he'll be able to double jump between platforms, while combining 2 or 3 clones will weigh him down in ways that'll make beating the level easier. Sometimes it makes sense to tackle an obstacle as one combined piece, while other times you'll need to switch between the pieces of fabric in order to trigger different parts of the level. It's basically a cross between the Lost Vikings and Yoshi's Woolly World. You know what? As puzzles go, there are a lot of clever ones to play through in Where's Samantha. Combining the characters and then splitting them apart plays a huge role, and the developers do an excellent job of mixing things up with new and unique challenges. There are portals, lasers, balance pads, spikes, deadly fans, and a whole bunch of different types of platforms that you'll need to navigate. And what's cool about these obstacles is that everything is made from real-world objects, such as hair combs, ratty old socks, flowers made from buttons, bells, pencils, and yes, of course, fabric. Every part of this world looks like something that I could recreate at my desk in about 20 minutes or so, which gives it a real tactile aesthetic. For most of the game, I found Where's Samantha to be a real charmer. I loved the look of the levels, the constantly changing obstacles, and the great performance by Rufus Hound. But the longer I played the game, the more holes I started to find in the fabric. The first sign of trouble was the color palette, which never really changed much throughout the game. Where most platformers mix things up with a wide assortment of backgrounds and stage types, we spend almost all of this game in what looks like the same location. Sure, the stages get more and more desaturated as the game goes on, but everything still has a very light tan look to it. None of the backgrounds stand out in any way, and I spent most of the game convinced that they were just using the same assets for every single stage. There are also a number of gameplay and level design problems. While the overall handling of the characters is tight and responsive, I did find that my character would get stuck in the environment if I wasn't careful enough. There's also the problem of not being able to see where you're jumping or what obstacle stands in your way. I ran into a lot of problems where I would simply jump into a bottomless pit because there's no way of looking around to see where the platforms are. So much of the game revolves around trial and error, which ultimately means that you're going to suffer a lot of cheap and pointless deaths that could have easily been avoided if the camera was just pulled back a little bit. But look, the repetitive graphics and cheap deaths are certainly annoying, but the real problem with this game is the ending. You would think that a game with so much story would lead to something, but it doesn't. Where Samantha has one of the most anticlimactic endings that I've ever seen. In fact, the conclusion is so unsatisfying that I went back to the final stage several times just to see if there was another path that led to a better ending. Look, I certainly didn't find anything, and there's no mention of multiple endings on the store page. The ending that we get is a big slap in the face to anybody who is invested in these characters and their journey. And I'm not afraid to admit that it made me a little angry. I don't think it's too much to say that it ruins a lot of what the story was going for. It's a stark reminder that if a developer is going to invest this much time in the narrative, then they absolutely need to pay it off in the end. This is one of the few games where you're actually better off quitting before the final stage. There's a lot to like about the style of Where's Samantha. From the fabric-filled levels, to the well-written story, to the real-world objects being used as obstacles. This is a charming platformer that controls well and offers a lot of great puzzles. Unfortunately, the game begins to unravel the moment you notice the repetitive backgrounds, dubious stage designs, and thoroughly unsatisfying ending. This is one of the few side-scrolling platformers where there's so much storytelling that it actually overshadows the gameplay. Look, I like a lot of what first-time developer Respect Studio is doing here, but I guarantee that the ending is gonna piss you off. You've been warned. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your least favorite video game ending? We've been going over a bunch of endings in our Game Over series, but most of those are pretty great. I'm sure you can think of something that was so unsatisfying that it totally ruined the rest of the game. Go ahead and let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, I'm currently hard at work on a review of a Toho fighting game, because of course I am. You'll have to tune in and see what I think of that. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.